Tonight we have a free raffle. I hope everybody get your name in. If you don't, try to get your name in now. An announcement, November 5th, there's going to be a footbridge dedicated in Lynn for Gold Star mothers, and Doris Saraka's called me today. She's going to send some information on that. So if any of us can attend that, I'll have to look into more information, but it'll be November 5th. The other thing I want to tell you, the bake sale.
I'd like to go, that's Doris's bridge.
The bake sale committee raised $400 running a bake sale for the Friends of the Linfield Library. So I just want to thank Chris putting that all together and ask her to thank each individually, all the bakers. So I don't know who the bakers were, but Chris can thank you all, and that's a great contribution to the Friends of the Linfield Library. Okay, I think we've already reimbursed the bakers, but if you're one of the bakers and you have, the money you've spent on supplies should be reimbursed from us. Okay, so tonight's speaker is Captain Mike Rutstein. He commands a schooner out of Salem called the Fame. He sails pretty much every day in the summer from Memorial Day right through Halloween, and you can take a ride on his boat for a small fee. I took it out of, I think, Gloucester many years ago when he was doing something for Trails to Sails, and it was a great time. Okay, in addition to being a sea captain, Captain Rutstein's a naval historian, well known in this area for giving great talks. We actually had him here years ago to talk about privateering. His presentation to us tonight is on what could be called the first naval battle of the American Revolution. It happened right here in Beverly Harbor near Salem Willows. And I asked the captain to bring in any merchandise he has for sale, and he came up with these great books and hats. And I'll probably take one of each. If I get cash in my pocket, I suppose. So please welcome tonight's speaker, Captain Mike Rutstein.
The problem is starting half an hour late is that I've had half an hour to eat the sugar cookies and get myself worked up into a total state. But it's nice to be back here. I really was in this room probably 10 or 15 years ago, giving a talk to the same chairs, some of the same people, and certainly enjoying some of the same baked goods. At some point, I'll probably start talking about Beverly's efforts to build the Hannah. And the expression that I've often used to describe Beverly's efforts to build the Hannah was that they had a series of bake sales. I am in no way putting down bake sales. Bake sales, I love a good bake sale. And that stuff is really, that's very impressive. Very impressive spread, and the little cookies that look like sailboats. Outstanding work, guys. So normally I give these talks and I come to talk about my boat, which is the Fame. Now the Fame is a replica of a privateer schooner from the War of 1812 that sailed out of Salem. And her story is that it was just a small fishing schooner that was basically outfitted by a bunch of unemployed sea captains at the beginning of the war. They went out as privateers. They captured the first prizes of the conflict, a ship and a brig off British Canada, which they brought back to Salem and sold for what was then the awe-inspiring sum of $7,000. It's a great story, but I'm not here to tell that story today. I'm here to tell a story that some of you have known for a long time, a story that's been bouncing around the North Shore for a couple hundred years, and that is the story of what happened in October of 1775. Before we had a navy, before we had a country, we had this conflict take place right here in Salem Sound, right, you could see this battle as you're driving across the Route 1A bridge between Salem and Beverly. That's where this battle was fought. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. This picture is a wonderful depiction, not of the Hannah, because there are no depictions of the Hannah. And one of the topics of my speech will be how little we actually know for sure about the Hannah, this vessel that we've been talking about for 250 years. But this is a vessel that we think was built in the same place, around the same time, for the same purpose. So we're taking her as kind of a great entree into what the original Hannah might have looked like. Can I go for the next slide?
Yep.
Ooh, look at that. It came right up.
It's not my PC.
It's all about the tech now. So the basics of the Hannah story. The Hannah was, as you can see, the first of one of several schooners that were outfitted. The Hannah, well, we'll talk about this in a sec, I guess. So this is the basic story. She's the first of several schooners that were outfitted to intercept British supply ships early in the Revolution. On this particular date, on October 10th, the anniversary that just passed. In fact, we had some sails, 2 sails on October 9th and October 10th, where we took the boat up into Beverly Harbor and sailed over the site of the battle, kind of pointed out the landmarks that are still there. Not much has moved. The towns have changed a lot, but the landmarks haven't moved, and had a great time doing it. The cool thing was that, October then is October now, so we had the same cool weather. We had the same high tide just a few days after the full moon, and it was really interesting to kind of look at the challenges that the vessels faced. Ships battling at sea are not static like a battle at land. This guy's on this hill, this guy's on that hill, they're firing each other. The water's moving, the boats are moving. The captains have a lot to think about apart from the fact that they're shooting at each other. So we're gonna talk about that a little bit. I show that map of what we know, what we don't know about what happened that day. So thank you. What do we know about the Hannah? Less than you would think. We have no idea what she looked like. So this is another depiction. And can we, is it possible to flip back and forth between
Sure.
slide 1 and slide 3?
Oh, sorry.
Slide 1. Nope.
The other one.
There we go.
Okay.
So obviously this is a period illustration and the other one is a modern painting. But you can see these boats have some things in common, not a lot in common. One thing they do have in common is you notice they are higher in the stern. They have a square topsail on the fore. This particular vessel, her foremast, the forward of the two masts, is very far forward in the boat. Do you guys notice that? Which is pretty unusual. And we think that one of the reasons for that is that this boat was specifically designed not for fishing. A lot of people thought for a long time that the Hannah had been a Marblehead fishing schooner. She seems to have been owned in Marblehead, but she seems to have been built and used for the purpose of bringing goods down to the West Indies. So she would typically travel to the West Indies with a cargo full of fish and timber, and she would come back with sugar and molasses. And these are not super big boats. This is about 50 feet from the front to the back of this boat. And by separating the mast widely like that, you actually can have a larger cargo opening, and it's easier to get cargo in and out and stored in this small vessel. It's a theory that we have. Okay, sorry, so we can go back forward again. So what do we know about the Hannah? Who owned her? For a long time, based on a series of historical documents, sometimes they're contradictory, people have thought that John Glover owned her. And John Glover is a name that you might have heard of because he became a general in the Revolution. He was the head, or became the head, of the Marblehead Militia. And the Marblehead Militia played an outsized role in the Revolution. They are going to be the crew, the captains, the officers, and the crew of the schooner Hannah at the very outset of the Revolution. They are also going to be the guys who saved Washington's bacon after the Battle of Long Island, when the army has to retreat across the East River. They have to retreat. There's no Throgs Neck Bridge in 1776. So they had to retreat via boats. And the people who manned those boats, that was the guys from Marblehead. In December of 1776, when Washington decided to launch a surprise attack against the Hessians, who rowed them across the Delaware River? It was the Marblehead guys under John Glover. So John Glover became a trusted confidant of Washington's, and the Marblehead guys proved their worth again and again and again. Glover seems to have owned the vessel. Glover was a committed patriot, and very fortunately for him and for everybody, he had shortly before the war got so ticked off at his townspeople for burning down a smallpox hospital that he'd helped build that he had moved his business operations to Beverly. And that's one of the reasons why John Glover, the Hannah, and Beverly all come together over the course of the story. So yeah, we're pretty sure that John Glover owned the schooner Hannah. There's been a lot of controversy about how big she was. There are some documents that seem to show the Continental Army leasing the Hannah, which is how they're going to get the boat. The Continental Army is going to lease the Hannah from her owner, John Glover. Those documents seem to suggest that she was 78 tons, which is a pretty good sized schooner, but more recent research has shown that she was probably more like 40 or 45 tons, which makes a lot of sense. It jives with a lot of the other facts that we know about the Hannah, and also makes her very similar in size actually to the Fame. When was she built? Well, the Hannah that we're talking about, the one that was owned by John Glover, if that's really the Hannah of the story, she was built in the 1760s up in Salisbury. She was built, like I said, not for fishing, but for cargo carrying. And that's what she was doing before the war. She was basically running from Marblehead to Barbados with these cargoes back and forth. Next slide, please. So 1775, we're going to talk about a battle that takes place in October, but a lot of stuff has gone down since 1775. What we, in the first 10 months of 1775, we almost had the revolution begin in Salem. Are people familiar with the story of Leslie's Retreat?
Yeah, this is
Okay.
a restaurant.
Yes, it was a restaurant, unfortunately no
That's
longer
right.
with us. Right. So, in February, the war nearly starts in Salem, and the war does start in April in Lexington and Concord. The same basic situation, right? The British are out there, they're looking for rebels, they're looking for stockpiles of cannons, of gunpowder. They're trying to defuse what they see as clearly a very dangerous situation in the colonies, and especially in Massachusetts. In Salem, wiser heads prevailed and there's no shooting. In Lexington and Concord, well, shooting, and the war starts. So after April, as you guys know, the Redcoats get chased back to Boston by the various militias from places all over eastern Massachusetts. And the British are kind of, they're hunkered down in Boston. Now Boston, as I'm sure you guys all know, in 1775 is almost an island, right? It's accessed only by a very narrow isthmus, which is very easily defended by the British soldiers. So the chances of getting the British out of Boston by a frontal attack on Boston are zero. It would be suicide. The British have cannons, they have troops, they've fortified the isthmus, it's not gonna happen. So the rebels have, some of you guys have probably imagined yourselves as military strategists. Anybody like me read about Alexander or Napoleon and think, what would I have done in that situation? Well, here's a classic military situation. You got a guy in a fortress and you want to get him to leave the fortress. Well, how do you do that? Starve him out. That's a classic, right? Goes all the way back to antiquity. Absolutely. Any other ideas?
Smoke them out.
Smoke them out. Bombard them or starve them out. This is classical stuff, right, guys? I mean, Alexander did it, Napoleon did it. So this is what the rebels are, you know, they don't have to reinvent the wheel here. They could try two things to get the British to leave Boston. They can starve them out or they can smoke them out. To smoke them out, they're going to need to get artillery, which they don't have. But something happens early in 1775 that changes that. That's right, they capture Fort Ticonderoga. Now they have a whole bunch of artillery. Here's the problem, it's not in Boston. Someone's got to drag those heavy cannons all the way from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. That's going to take some time. But in the meantime, they have a few cannon. They're thinking about places where they could put them, where they could lob cannonballs into Boston. And the first place they try to put the cannons is?
Breed Hill.
That's right. So you've got these hills in Charleston overlooking Boston, overlooking the anchorage of the British fleet. What a great place to put cannons that are going to annoy the hell out of the British. Let's try that. How'd that work out?
Dorchester Heights.
Yeah, well, eventually. They haven't got to Dorchester Heights yet. So they in a surprise move, they fortify Bunker Hill. The British wake up the next morning, look at that and say, oh, well, we can't let that happen. We got to do something about that. And they very wisely launch a frontal assault, which, wow. You all know what happened at Bunker Hill.
Yeah.
What happened as a result of Bunker Hill is that a number of myths get created. And the most pernicious myth, a myth that lasts in the American consciousness for the next couple of generations, is that militia can defeat regular troops. And that turns out not to be true. But it takes us a couple of generations to unlearn that. Yes, militia in prepared positions can fend off unwise frontal attacks. We'll find out that again at New Orleans. Every once in a while, this turns out to be true. But as a strategy for basing your nation's military preparedness on, it turns out to be a very bad plan. Anyway, Bunker Hill turns out poorly for the Patriots because their defenses get overrun, they get thrown back to where they were. And then 2 weeks later, George shows up. We all know George. That great good man, George. And there he is as a relatively younger man, younger than your $1 bill, right? Younger than your quarter. George shows up on July 3rd, and he has all the same thoughts that we just thought. Well, we can smoke him out, we can starve him out. Smoke him out, that didn't work so hot the first time, but we may be able to do better the second time. We'll start working on that. We're going to start working on how we would suddenly fortify a hill, how we would defend that hill if it were suddenly attacked. We know we've got artillery coming from Fort Ticonderoga, but that's not going to happen for a little bit. In the meantime, let's try the other thing. The other thing is starve them out, right? Boston, as I'm sure you guys know, is a seaport. And who rules the waves? The rebels?
Britannia.
No, Britannia rules the waves, exactly. So British supply ships are coming and going pretty much at will. The British have everything they need. I wouldn't say everything they need. So things are a little tight. Firewood is in short supply. But they are not going to have to leave because of a shortage of supplies because boats are coming and going unhindered. And George Washington looks around him and says, what can we do about that? And George gets talking to John Glover and some of the other officers at his disposal, and they decide, well, we really are going to need some kind of a naval force. One of the things we could use that naval force is we could intercept some of those British ships going in and out of Boston. We could get some of those supplies, not only to deny the supplies to the British, but to get supplies for George Washington, who has an astonishing shortage of what? Everything, especially gunpowder. He needs any military supplies that are coming into Boston that can get diverted to the Continental Army are going to make this army much, much more effective. I believe when Washington shows up, they do a return with like an inventory of all the gunpowder they have, and they find out that every soldier can basically fire their weapon 3 times and that's it. And supposedly, the story is that after Washington read this report, he did not speak to anybody for 24 hours. He's been put in charge of an army that has no gunpowder. The British, they're aware that there's a shortage. They're not aware of how severe that it is. Anyway, so Washington is kicking around all these different ideas of different ways to get rid of the British, cutting off their supplies, arming ships for that purpose. That seems like a good idea. He's also going to need ships for another purpose. I don't know if anybody was around just, I think a little over a month ago, in Danvers, they celebrated a very interesting anniversary from the Revolutionary War, which was that Benedict Arnold's army, his force detached from the army in Cambridge, marched through here on their way to Newburyport, where they got on ships provided by the Continental Army, which took them to the Kennebec, and then they rowed up the Kennebec and marched overland and attacked Canada. A very bold plan, but it was going to require some ships, right? So Washington needs ships for a bunch of different reasons. The first ship that he acquires, with an eye towards both of these plans, is the Hannah. That happens by the middle of August. He leases this schooner, the Hannah, from John Glover. John Glover's right there at his right hand. It's pretty easy to imagine how that transaction might have come together. And they're thinking that the Hannah, number one, could be a cruiser, could go out and try to capture supply ships. Number two, they could arm it, and it could be an armed escort for some of these transport vessels that are going to carry Arnold's army from Newburyport up to Maine. So 2 possible purposes for the Hannah. And on September 5th, Hannah makes her first cruise. Arnold is not ready to go yet. The Hannah goes out cruising. Next slide. Let's talk a minute about what exactly the Hannah is, because boy, I get aggravated beyond all belief reading that people think that Hannah was the first U.S. naval vessel, or people calling Hannah a privateer, and she was none of those things. She was certainly not a pirate, although the British would have described her as that. The British would have described her that because she was a vessel that was authorized by an entity they didn't recognize, right? So that's going to happen again and again in the Revolution. John Paul Jones will be referred to as a pirate, but she's clearly not. We all know what piracy is. Piracy is one of those things like pornography. You know it when you see it. Privateering is a little bit more closely defined, right? Most people, when I talk about privateering on the Fame, we start with piracy, and then we define privateering as legal piracy. Why is it legal? Because your country is at war. That establishes the legal framework for what looks like piracy, and what smells like piracy, and what tastes like piracy, to be palatable to everybody, because there is a war on, your government has declared war against somebody, your government has further authorized privateering commissions, also called letters of marque, to be issued against that country. And if you obtain one of those pieces of paper, one of those commissions, one of those licenses, you can then go out and try to capture enemy vessels. And if you can bring them back and go through a legal process by which you prove that the ship and or the cargo you captured are enemy property, you get to sell the whole mess on eBay and keep the money. They did not have eBay in 1775. I'm aware of that. But they did use auctions, because auctions were the fairest way to sell off ships and prizes in a transparent way so that nobody felt like they got screwed. That's what privateering is. Hannah's clearly not a privateer. Privateers are privately owned, which the Hannah is. The Hannah does not have a commission to go out and capture prizes. Privateers were not manned by militia. They were not manned by the military. That's where the Navy comes in, right? The Navy is a government-sponsored entity, right? That's basically projecting military force on the ocean and doing whatever they need to do. They might have big ships, small ships, troops, amphibious troops, sailors. We all know what a Navy looks like, just like piracy. Everyone knows what a Navy is. But the Hannah, is the Hannah a naval vessel? No. Well, there isn't a Navy. That's the thing. George Washington leases this schooner and gives it a commission from the Army, puts Army officers on board who happen to be sailors because they're all from Marblehead. Congress is eventually going to create a Navy for the Continental Services, but not until October 13th. So right up until and past the date of our battle, there's no such thing, even as the Continental Navy, forget about the United States Navy, There is no United States. Why?
No declaration.
Because we haven't declared independence yet. That's not going to happen until July 4th of 1776. So that's well into the future. So if Hannah is not a pirate vessel or a privateer vessel or a naval vessel, what the hell is she? Well, this is what people have a hard time wrapping their brain around. She was none of the above. She was simply a privately owned armed schooner that was leased, not owned by the Continental Army and manned by militia. That's not a convenient answer, nor is it a one-word label, but that is the truth. Anything else, just reject it out of hand. Next slide, please. So, as we talked about, the Hannah may have been originally intended to cruise or to accompany with Benedict Arnold's transports. We don't know which they had in mind, but because Arnold's expedition is not ready yet, she starts cruising first. Her crew are on board. They've got about 40 men on board. Officers from Glover's regiment under a man named Nicholson Broughton. John Glover's son is also on board, and they've got about 35 crew. She sets out from Beverly. She's based in Beverly, right about, if you all know the Beverly waterfront, she's about right between where the Jubilee Yacht Club is and Beverly Port Marine. If there are any sailors here, that makes sense. The rest of you are like, I don't know. This is one of those places, if you're driving over the Salem Bridge from Beverly to Salem and you look left and say, oh, look how pretty, you would see this Beverly waterfront right below you, and then right as the coast turns, there's a group of condominiums. People know what I'm talking about? Yeah, right before that group of condominiums, before you turn the corner and get out into the open sound. That's where they're basing these vessels. That's where they're getting the vessels ready. That's where their home dock is. So she goes out on September 5th, and she has a very auspicious beginning, which is that she runs smack into 2 British naval vessels, and she runs into Gloucester to hide. Good plan. You don't want to mess a little schooner like the Hannah. She is armed with 3 4-pounder cannon, a 2-pounder cannon, and a bunch of swivel guns. How do I describe what that is to you? A 4-pound cannon would be probably about 4.5 or 5.5 feet long, somewhere in there, and would fire a shot about the size of a wiffle ball. How's that sound? On a little carriage with wheels? Okay. The 2-pounder is much smaller than that. Probably not a lot bigger than the swivel guns that we have on the Fame. And a swivel gun is really just a miniature cannon. It might be 2 feet, it might be anywhere from 2 to 3 feet long, but it is basically, it might have a muzzle that's maybe an inch wide, and it's usually used not to fire itty bitty little cannonballs the size of jawbreakers or golf balls. It's usually used like a big shotgun. And that is a very effective weapon for both pirates and privateers. As we'll see, not so much in this battle, but the Hannah would have had probably 4 to 6 of those in addition to her carriage guns. So the carriage guns are small by the standards of the Royal Navy, but you wouldn't want to have one aimed at you. September 5th, she goes out, she runs into the Lively, which is a frigate. That's not the Constitution, but that idea. Think about half the size of the Constitution. Still much, much bigger, much more impressive, and much more dangerous. And the Foy, I know it says Fowie or Fowie, but it seems to be pronounced Foy, near as I can tell from my British friends. Anyway, they chase her into Gloucester. She runs and she hides. Eventually, they don't seem to know what Hannah is doing, by the way, at this point. They just see a schooner and chase it. They're not aware that she's intended to try and capture British supply ships. So they go off. 2 days later, the Hannah ventures out again, and she captures a ship called the Unity. And the Unity, the problem with the Unity is it's very unclear who's got her and where she's going. The problem with that is that she has already been captured by somebody else. She's been captured by the Lively and the Foy. And she was a rebel-owned vessel that was on a trading voyage that was captured by these British warships, and they have sent her into Boston with her supplies, which is what you would do if you were a British captain, right? But the Hannah guys don't know this, and the British prize crew, the people who've been put on board from the British vessel to sail the vessel into Boston, are not very forthcoming, as you might imagine. So the crew are very excited because they think they've captured a British vessel, when in fact all they're doing is liberating a rebel vessel that's already been captured. Now, they've been promised a share of anything they capture. So when they capture the Unity, they're really excited. They're going to get some money. They're thrilled about this. And they bring that vessel back into Gloucester, and they go to sleep counting their riches in their heads. And over the next day or two, it comes out that the vessel is actually owned by the governor of New Hampshire, who's a noted patriot and a rebel. And and it's going to have to be returned. And they completely lose their cookies over this, and they mutiny. And they present themselves to the officers and say that we're not the officers now, this is just the enlisted men, but the enlisted men refuse to go along, refuse to sail the vessel any longer, and Washington has to have them rounded up, brought back to Cambridge, which is where his headquarters is. And the ringleader, a guy named Joseph Searles, is whipped, and the others are dismissed from the army. It's not a great start for the Hannah. Next slide. So, Hannah gets a new crew. More guys from the Marblehead Brigade, right? And she resumes sailing, same officers, new crew. This takes a couple weeks to happen, all this mutiny stuff, the trial of the mutineers, the punishment of the mutineers, et cetera, et cetera. But by the beginning of October, she's up and running. On October 7th, she does something very interesting. She chases a brig right into Boston. She doesn't capture her. So here's the problem with not capturing her. When she gets away, the first thing she does is she sails into Boston, and the captain goes up to the British Admiral, Samuel Graves, who you can see in the painting, and says, "You'll never guess what just happened to me. I got chased in by some kind of pirate or rebel schooner, and I think it might be the vessel they captured up in Machias," which turns out not to be true. That's another story. But basically, he makes it known to the British Admiral, there's this vessel out there, and they're trying to capture our supply ships, and you, sir, need to do something about it. So Admiral Graves does something about it. He takes the best sailing ship that is immediately under his command, which is a 16-gun ship called the Nautilus, and Captain John Collins in charge of the Nautilus, of the 16-gun ship Nautilus. He says, go find this boat and destroy it. It looks like she's operating out of the North Shore ports, Beverly, Gloucester, some are up there. Get on it, go do something. Next slide. So this leads us to the day of our battle. On October 10th, we have a bunch of different sources for this about when exactly the action started and where even the Hannah left from. I don't know if anybody has done any research into Marblehead schooner, about Marblehead history, but there is a guy who kept the diary in Marblehead for a long time, which is published in 2 volumes, and he reports all this stuff. He was a rigger. He rigged vessels, and he paid very close attention to what was going on with ships and shipping in the Marblehead area. And he is pretty much constantly reporting in his diary the movements of the Hannah, and they don't quite match up to what we know. So something's going on there that we've yet to solve. But anyway, the consensus is that Hannah is leaving from Beverly on October 10th, right around noontime, and we know because that's when the tide begins to fall. High tide at 12 o'clock, tide starts flowing, the Hannah sails for Beverly on her mission to go capture British supply ships. What she doesn't know is the British are fully aware of her and her mission, and waiting for her is the Nautilus. Now the Nautilus is 5 miles east of Halfway Rock. Halfway Rock so called because it's about halfway between Lynn and Gloucester. So the vessels are 6 or 7 miles apart at 12 o'clock. By 1 o'clock, they are in sight of each other. The Hannah is sailing out of Salem Sound past Cat Island, if you guys know where what's now called Children's Island, where the Marblehead YMCA camp is. She's headed past that island in a more or less southeast direction towards Boston Harbor. The Nautilus is out there, she sights the Hannah, and the chase begins. As soon as the Nautilus sees the Hannah, she starts chasing the Hannah. As soon as the Hannah realizes that there's a large vessel chasing her, she turns around and runs for Beverly. And the vessels then spend the next 2 hours in a stern chase. In other words, right one behind the other, like a car chase in a movie. The Hannah fleeing, the Nautilus trying to follow up. By 2 o'clock, an hour later, the vessels can be seen from Salem as they cross right to left across the mouth of the harbor, both vessels headed towards Beverly. And just to make this clear, we have a map on the next slide. Yay! Okay, that's not showing out as well as I hoped it would. Also, the map may be made additionally confusing by the fact that it's not quite north up, but the lines are north up, north, south, east, west. This is, sorry, I'm going to get in all of your
One
way.
laser pointer?
What was there? Oh, look at that. You guys are just the height of technology.
Yes, aren't we?
And I have to do, okay, so here's Salem. Here's Marblehead. Here's Beverly. Here's that bridge that we talked about that you guys all drive over all the time, right? So this is where the Hannah was based, and she spent the morning going, following the tide out past, there's Children's Island I was talking about. So she's going out in this direction, and the Nautilus is over here at noontime, right? So right about the time that she separates herself from the land, so she's in this area, general area, She is visible to the Nautilus, and the chase starts, right? So Beverly, the Hannah turns around and runs for Beverly, and the Nautilus is coming right after her. The red lines are showing there's a lot of stuff out there in Salem Sound. There's a lot of rocks and islands, and you know, the Marblehead guys were probably well aware of those rocks and islands and where they were and how to stay away from them. The British guys, not so much, right? So we were kind of hypothesizing. This is something I did for the sailors who came sailing with us last week, and it might not interest you guys as much, but we kind of talked about the different routes that you could take. The tide is falling. There's a big shallow area in here. So notice there's a couple ways you could do that. You can go this way around the shallow area. You can go the long way around the shallow area. Or if you really have a set of cojones, you can sail right across the shallow area, because if you're Nicholson Broughton in the Hannah, you're in a vessel that probably draws 7 or 8 feet of water, whereas you're being chased by a boat that draws at least 12. So you can sail places that he can't sail. If you have the guts to go there yourself, you might really score. You might be able to lure the Nautilus into running aground here over the middle ground. So I think that if Nicholson Broughton had any cojones whatsoever, this is what he would have done. But knowing all we know about Nicholson Broughton, and we know quite a bit about him, I think he went the long way around. That's not to say he was a coward. He was transactional. Anyway, this is the wind direction that we hypothesized on that day. The United States Naval Observatory sat down and figured out all this stuff for someone who had written a book back in the 1970s and decided, you know, when the weather, when the tides, how the wind was this day. It was a clear day. Like I said, the tide was high around midday and kept falling right till about 6:30. We know the sun set around 5 o'clock. We know the wind was west, southwest, somewhere in here, and blowing fairly strong. So the problem with the Hannah and the Nautilus is that the Nautilus, being a much larger vessel with these winds kind of on their beam, she's going to be moving much faster than the Hannah. So they start the race and they're probably, 5 miles apart. They're going to show up here about half a mile apart. So the Nautilus has closed the 5 mile gap to about 1 mile by the time the Hannah gets to here. And here's the problem. When the Hannah does get to here, they're running for Beverly, right? They're running for what they expect to be safety. They're probably thinking that at some point the British are going to stop chasing them, right? These guys aren't going to chase us all the way to Beverly, are they? That would be crazy. Look at all these rocks and shoals and nasty places. So even if Broughton didn't have the guts to do this and try and drag them over the shallow water, Broughton would have dodged this way and dodged that way. And do the British know to do that? All they probably know is to follow the Hannah and hope that if there's enough water for the Hannah, there's enough water for them. Here's decision point, right? By the time Broughton gets to here, when he's getting close to the mouth of Beverly, he's realized 2 important things. They're going to determine the whole course of the battle. Number 1, the British are not giving up. They're not giving up the chase. They're chasing him right into Beverly. That's got to be a very bad moment for Nicholson Broughton and his crew. Because the other thing they realize is they've got to go this way. They've got to go up this channel to get into Beverly. And what's the wind doing? It's blowing right in their face. And what's the tide doing? It's 3 o'clock now. High tide was at 3 o'clock. So it's maximum tide flowing out. You've got maximum tide flowing out this way. The wind is flowing out this way. He's not going to be able to sail the Hannah up this channel. This is a dead end for the Hannah. So what do you do? Can't fight him. Way too powerful. So by the time Broughton gets to here and he realizes these 2 things. Number 1, the tide and the wind are in my face. Number 2, the British are not giving up. They're going to chase me right in. I am going to save my skin. I'm going to save the skin of my men. And I'm going to run my boat right up on the beach. Anyone ever been to Independence Park in Beverly? That's where he does it. Runs that boat right up onto the beach right there. He's not going to be able to make the turn past, that's where the condos are, right there, where I've got the laser pointer. He's going to go right up onto Independence Beach, right around here. And the Nautilus, whether she took this path or that path, is coming right in behind him. And within half an hour, the Nautilus is going to show up and anchor right off that beach. 3 o'clock. The Hannah is deliberately run aground near the north end of Independence Park. What do? When I have told this story for many years, I've said that the Marblehead guys jumped overboard and ran into the woods making noises like whoop, 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 whoop. They don't want to be captured. It's early in the Revolution. What's going to happen to rebels who are captured? Has anyone read any British history? What do the British kings do to rebels that they capture?
Impress them.
Kill him.
I mean, terrible things. Impressment, would they be lucky if it was just impressment? Oh, people get hung and drawn and quartered. They dug up Cromwell and chopped his head off. You know, he's been dead for several years. No one wants to be made an example of at this very early stage in the revolution. That's one of the reasons why Broughton is so set on running his boat up onto the beach to make sure that his men can escape. You don't want to be the first ones captured. There were a very small number of people captured at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Most of the people who were captured at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and I'm talking like 20, 25 guys, were only captured because they were very badly wounded. And most of them promptly died. So it hasn't really been an issue. We haven't really tested the issue of what the British are going to do with their rebel prisoners. But a lot of people are concerned that it's going to be similar to the way Scottish and Irish rebels had been treated in the previous century, which is to say, not good. No one wants to try that. So, what do when they hit the beach? Do they run into the woods? Well, some people have tried to spin this favorably, make the rebels look good, and have said, and there seems to be some evidence this may be true, that they got their cannons off the Hannah and onto the beach. It would have been a difficult thing to do, but it's possible. They would have had to take apart the cannons in their carriages, put them into boats, row them ashore, drag them up onto the beach, put them back together, arm them, get all the tools that they need to fire the cannon. Certainly could be done, and they have a half an hour to do it before the Nautilus shows up. There's been quite a bit of controversy about whether that actually happened or not. What we do know happens is that half an hour after the Hannah hits the beach, the Nautilus shows up and she anchors. And remember, if you anchor a vessel, it's going to point into that wind and that current. So the Nautilus is pointing kind of towards Salem, and her whole side, what they would call a battery, all the guns on the starboard side of the Nautilus are pointing right at the Hannah. So 8 of her 16 guns are pointing right at the Hannah at a distance of about 300 yards, maybe less. Not good. And within 10 minutes, the Nautilus begins firing at the beached Hannah. There are a lot of anecdotal stories that are told in Beverly about this battle, about how the British shelled the town, and cannonballs ended up in people's homes, and they shot at the church. I don't believe that's true. I think that the British were very focused on doing what they had come to do, which is destroying the schooner. And if you did what we did last week, and you sail in those waters, and you look at the beach from the water, you can see that a very small elevation of your gun would send the cannonball up over the hill into Beverly, as opposed to hitting the beach or the bluff. And as the militia start to show up, because the Beverly militia, the Salem militia, and the Manchester militia are all aware of this chase that's been going on for the last hour and a half, and they're all marching to the sound of the guns. When the militia show up and they start lining up on the bluff, because it's not a flat beach in Beverly, there's a beach and then there's a kind of a bluff up to Lothrop Street. The militia would be standing up there, and if the British elevated any of their guns to reach the militia, then yes, the cannonballs would have ended up in town. They're not deliberately shelling the town, the churches. They're not trying to sow, civilian chaos like they will later in the month when they go up to Maine and bombard the town of Falmouth. So the Nautilus is firing at the Hannah. His job is to destroy the privateer, right? So that's primarily what they're firing at. As the militia shows up, is that going to distract their attention? Yes, probably. But the goal is to hit the schooner and hit it hard. The local militia starts showing up. By 4 o'clock, so the Hannah's been on the beach for an hour, the Nautilus has been firing for an hour. Captain Collins sees enough militia on the beach that he abandons this idea that he originally had, which is when he first anchored, he thought, let's get the boats out. Because remember, every big boat has little boats on board. They're going to put the little boats in the water, put the Marines, because every Royal Naval vessel has a contingent of Marines, put those Marines in the boat, they'll row ashore, scatter the militia, and they'll burn the privateer, right? Which would be much better than just bombarding it from 300 yards away. We're going to set it on fire, and then we could go back to the Admiral, and he'll say, good boy, here's a bone. Once the militia starts showing up, Collins says, maybe it's not such a good idea to put the Marines on shore, but keep firing the cannons, guys. All right, so now it's 4:15. Now, something that Collins has not anticipated yet happens, which is that on the other side of him, can we quickly go back to the map?
There we go. Sorry.
Let's go right back to, so remember we said this is Salem. So here is the Nautilus, here is the Hannah. The militia are all probably lined up on the beach or on the bluff overlooking the beach right here. At 4:15, the guys from Salem, here's downtown Salem, have managed to have horses drag their field pieces. They've got 4 and 6 pounder field pieces. So a 6 pounder is a more serious gun than a 4 pounder. A 6 pounder is probably 5 feet long and fires something a little bit bigger than a baseball or a tennis ball, and it can fire at a good half mile. So they're well within range, and where they're going to set it up, does everyone know the Willows Park in Salem?
Yes.
Right there where the bandstand is and the Willows Yacht Club, they are setting up those cannons right there, and they're facing right at the Nautilus. They are at a distance of probably 400 or 500, 600 yards, probably closer to 600 yards. They've got a little bit of elevation, and they're nice solid ground. These poor slobs on the Hannah, if they did get their cannons on shore, they're trying to fire from a sandy beach, which is firing a gun on a naval carriage from a sandy beach is going to be a whole bag of toys. You don't want to go there. But these guys have a field piece. They're firing from firm ground. Unfortunately, one of the first things that happens is one of the guys from Salem manages to blow his hand off. He is the only casualty, except for Captain Broughton, who, when he wades ashore from the Hannah, catches a cold. He'll be the only rebel casualty of the conflict. But yes, a Salem gentleman managed to blow his hand off. But by 4:15, now you've got the militia firing from Beverly. You've got the militia firing from Salem. He's sitting here in the crossfire. Collins thinks to himself, this is not great. Okay, let's go back where we were. At 4:50, after about 35 minutes, about 35 minutes of this, Collins decides, yeah, I think it's time to get out of here. And here's the problem. In order to get your anchor back and leave, this is going to be more sailing jargon. But a square-rigged vessel like the Nautilus is designed to be propelled with wind from the side or from behind it, right? Remember, the wind and the current are right in front of the Nautilus, and the Nautilus is pointing right at them. So if the Nautilus puts sails up, it will just move backwards onto a shallow mussel bed. So they can't do that. What they need to do is take a line from the back of the boat, attach it to the anchor line, pull themselves up with that so they can change the angle of the boat. So the boat's not pointing right at the wind anymore. And the ship. Once the ship is not pointing directly at the angle, then they can try to set some sails and get the vessel to sail off in one direction or the other. So she'll be in control instead of just going backwards. They try to do this, it's called setting a spring, but the spring lines part, and in the process of doing this, they find that they have slipped backwards, the Nautilus has slipped backwards and is aground. Now it's really bad. This is not a good situation. So the Nautilus is in a crossfire, it's aground, the sun is about to set, it's getting dark, which is good if you're the British, right? So the Nautilus continues to try to kedge off, right? So setting a spring didn't work, they were aground, now they're trying to kedge off. Kedging is when you take your anchor, you put it into one of your boats, you row the boat away from your ship as far as you can with the anchor in it and a line attached back to the boat, then you drop the anchor and you set the whole crew to turning the capstan to try and pull yourself towards the anchor. This is a way to get yourself when you're aground off of that obstruction, wherever you're on. So they're trying to do this. It's not working. The tide is falling. They're very stuck. The rebels are firing at them. Thank God, and the British don't know this, they're very short of powder, aren't they? We know that. So a lot of people who have written about this battle kind of assume that the rebels must have been terrible, terrible shots because they don't manage to completely destroy the Nautilus in the couple hours that they have her at their mercy. They probably had a very limited amount of powder and shot. They probably weren't able to keep up a brisk fire for the whole time. We know this. But a lot of historians have tended to ignore that and to blame the rebels for just being lousy shots. Because sure enough, they're not going to do a lot of damage to the Nautilus. Not enough to sink her anyway. By low tide, at 6:45, now it's dark, right? The sun set an hour and a half ago. The moon is probably just coming up. So you can see, but it's dark. The Nautilus is hard aground, they're taking fire from both sides, but we know lack of ammo, the fact that the Patriots are not very experienced, and the fact that it's getting dark are limiting the amount of damage that they're doing. And by 7:30, the tide has started to come back, right? So you got 45 minutes, the tide is flowing back. They finally do manage to free themselves by kedging, they set sail, and they depart. And that's the end of the battle. Not a very dramatic end of the battle, right? Because there aren't really any clear winners and losers. Or are there? I guess we'll see in a minute. But I would think that the British are very, very happy to get away, and the rebels have probably done everything that they can do. So next slide. So who wins, who loses? What are the results? So obviously, it's not been a great day for the Hannah, right? She got chased in her home port. They fired at her for a couple of hours from their starboard battery. Probably did quite a bit of damage to her. But on the other hand, the Nautilus was driven away. That's a good thing. And the important thing, which is that Beverly can be used as a port for the Hannah and other privateers, that continues to happen. Nothing that Collins or the Nautilus is able to accomplish keeps the rebels from using Beverly as a port. Because I think we've just proven our point. This is a very difficult place to get into if the tide and the current aren't right. And once it is fortified, which is going to happen el pronto, it's going to be an extremely useful place. So the British, obviously, their vessel has been damaged, but mostly in the rigging. So as Collins says in his report to the British Admiral, "'Tis lucky the rebels fired so high." Because they do a lot of damage to the rigging, to the spars, to the sails, not a lot of damage to the hull. And a couple men are wounded. One man has his leg shot off and later died. A couple days after the battle, he dies. Obviously, the Nautilus has failed. The Nautilus has failed in its mission. Luckily for John Collins, he didn't have to go back completely empty-handed, because after the Nautilus sailed off at 7:30 on the night of the 10th, on the morning of the 11th, the sun came up, and what did the Nautilus see as she was sailing through Boston Bay? But a schooner that was sailing into Salem, and Collins promptly captured it. They brought it into Salem. It was a rebel vessel. I don't think they even knew the war was on, coming back from the West Indies full of goods. They brought that into Boston. That was a nice prize for the British. So he wasn't completely empty-handed. Unfortunately, he did run aground going into Boston. Anyway, so they failed in their mission. However, they escaped a perilous situation, and I'm sure they could say to themselves, well, now the rebels will at least think twice about sending out vessels, except they don't. If anything, the rebels double down. They're more committed after the battle to sending out cruisers, not the Hannah, of course, because the Hannah is badly damaged, but to sending out more cruisers, to having a naval force, and especially to using Beverly as a base for these schooners, and they immediately begin fortifying Beverly. I believe the battle is on the 10th. On the 11th, there's a town meeting in Beverly, and they immediately vote to fortify what's called Woodbury Point then, but it's now the park, Lynch Park. You know Lynch Park? So there was a fort there, and if you've been to Lynch Park, you know it's a great place to put a couple of cannon. You can keep people sailing in and out of Beverly. But they're also going to build a fort at Tuck's Point, right at the corner, kind of where Beverly went aground, and there'll eventually be a sizable fort in Salem with larger cannon, Fort Lee. Not Fort Pickering, that's the one that's right by the harbor and by the little lighthouse there, but Fort Lee, which is kind of in the middle of the neck there. There's not much to see there. Now it's all bike trails for mountain bikers. Next slide. So there's been a lot written about this. As you can see, as a battle, it's not much of a battle. Nobody gets vanquished. It's not a massacre. It's not clearly a win or a loss for anybody. But the fact of it being a first, that's really enticing for people, particularly for the people of Beverly and Marblehead, right? I know here at Linfield, you probably don't have a lot of sympathy for either one of those people. But the Beverly folks could say that we were Washington's naval base, and that the vessels were based here, and that therefore we are the birthplace of the American Navy. How about that? And the Marblehead people, of course, have been pushing back against that, saying, well, the schooner came from Marblehead, which has been controversial, but we think it probably did. Certainly the captain and the officers came from Marblehead. Not that they did an outstanding job, but they did come from Marblehead. And they've been fighting about this for 250 years. It's a ridiculous fight, really, because, as I've said before, there was no United States and there was no Navy. So why are we arguing about this point? It just goes to show that people from Beverly and Marblehead will argue about anything if you give them an opportunity. And if you start them off with a couple rum drinks, it can go on for hours. A gentleman named Alan Hovey and a group of people in Beverly decided back in the 1970s that they wanted to build a replica of the Hannah. I think this came out of the bicentennial. Remember how excited we all were in the bicentennial? I was 12 years old. I thought it was just the bee's knees. Boy, all kinds of great stuff going on. People doing all kinds of history, which I always loved history. And you guys probably remember as a time when there were great tall ships events and great reenactments going on. It got people excited in lots of different ways. And it got the people in Beverly excited about maybe building a replica of the Hannah. Why not? Fortunately or unfortunately, there was a gentleman in, I think now he lives in Rockport, but a gentleman named Alan Hovey, an amateur historian, a very bright guy, a guy who knew where all the sources were. He spent a lot of time doing research into the Hannah, and he came up with a whole bunch of theories that were very different from what kind of the accepted wisdom was about the Hannah and the battle and the whole 9 yards. And here are a few of them. Some of them have been disproven. Some of them we just don't have the evidence either way. One of his theories was that the Hannah was not the vessel owned by John Glover. It was actually owned by the Lee family of Manchester. The Lees are also a Marblehead family. They lived in both Marblehead and Manchester, different branches of the family brothers. And the Lees were prominent patriots for sure. But a different boat and a little bit bigger, which that's important if you're going to build a replica of it. You got to know how big it was, right? And hubby's theory was, well, it's a bigger boat than what you guys are saying. Another is that all these very confusing invoices we have where Hannah is crossed out and Hancock is written in, the reason for that is because the guys in Beverly who were working on the Hannah were calling it the Hancock. And the reason they were calling it the Hancock was they were all ticked off that George Washington had gotten named the commander-in-chief, right? He was a Virginian. And to the militia, to the people here in Marblehead, the revolution was our baby, right? We started it. We're the ones who took arms. We're the ones who beat back the British troops and sent them scurrying back to Boston. This is our baby. I don't know who this guy is from Virginia. What, because he lost a battle in the French and Indian War? Now he gets to be commander-in-chief? I mean, they knew nothing about Washington and cared very little. They all thought that John Hancock, even if Hancock maybe was not a strong candidate, he did want the job. He wanted to at least be offered the job. And there was a lot of sympathy for Hancock. He was the local boy. He was their Carl Yastrzemski, and Tony C would be a better analogy. If you guys are with me on Tony C. So that's an interesting theory. He spends quite a bit of time talking about. Here's the real doozy: is that Nicholson, Broughton, and the Hannah were out there deliberately trying to lure the Nautilus in to a trap in Beverly. That's nuts. That's absolutely nuts. Broughton is not the guy. The plan doesn't make any sense. They at least would have had some ammunition and been ready for the guys instead of having to march to the sound of the battle like they did. It in no way looks like a trap or an ambush. But again, Hovey is trying to make the story of the Hannah more exciting by making the rebels look a little bit more intentional than they actually are. They're actually pretty reactive, and Broughton is nobody's idea of a hero. Another thing he says later is that that the local officials kind of glorified the engagement, tried to make the rebels look good, minimize the damage that had been done to the Hannah, maximize the damage they had supposedly done to the Nautilus. That one I actually buy, because sure, who wouldn't do this? And anyone who reads any news outlet today will notice that they tend to talk up their friends and downplay their enemies, right? I mean, there's no such thing as objective media then or now. That probably certainly is true. But the doozy, the whopper, the headliner of Alan Hovey's book, and he wrote a whole unpublished book about the Hannah, was that the Hannah was rebuilt after the battle, renamed the Lynch, that this whole thing was kept secret from the officers at the Continental headquarters, and that she went out in service again as a vessel called the Lynch, and she was used to carry dispatches to the Continental Congress's representatives who were negotiating with the French to try and get help from the French and the Dutch and hopefully draw the French into the war. There certainly was a vessel called the Lynch that was captured on that mission. Was she the Hannah, having been rebuilt and renamed? Wow, we cannot disprove it, but my theory, having done a lot of historical research over the last 30 years, beginning with this story, because before we built the Fame, I thought I wanted to build the Hannah, is that there may be multiple explanations for anything that happens, particularly when you go back to the Revolutionary War and you have a lot of records that don't agree or are missing. But usually the simpler explanations are going to hold water better than the more complicated explanations. And Hovey's explanations are very complicated indeed. So you've already heard you got my 2 cents on this. The whole thing is foolishness. But I'm sure you guys have seen these things. You still see Hannah everywhere you go in Beverly. There's a Hannah school, there's Hannah apartments. This schooner, of course, is supposed to represent the Hannah. That's right down at the base of, right by the Mission Boathouse restaurant now, with the base of the Beverly base of the bridge that leads to Salem. That's where this sign is. And you can see Washington's Naval Base, 1775 to 76. The schooner Hannah Market is just up Cabot Street from that bridge. And there's a very fanciful depiction of what the Hannah looked like. Yeah, no Navy, no United States, therefore not the first United States naval vessel. The Hannah because it has such a grip on the North Shore, and because when I first came up to the North Shore in 1996, I was keeping a boat in Beverly, I kind of fell into this whole Hannah manhole and started thinking that, gee, you know, what a great idea it would be if someone built a replica of the Hannah. I was keeping a boat in Beverly and driving past that sign that we just saw. You know, every time I went to my boat, I had never heard of the Hannah. I grew up in Sudbury, where we, you know, didn't talk about the Hannah too much. But, you know, I thought I knew my American history. I certainly thought I knew my Revolutionary War. I'd never heard the Hannah story. Went to the Beverly Public Library, looked it up, and I came to that conclusion. Well, I came to two conclusions. One is, we definitely should have a replica of the Hannah in Beverly. And number two was, wow, I'm not the first person to have this thought. These people have been thinking about doing this for years and years and years, and I need to get in touch with them. So I got in touch with them, and at the same time, I reached out to one of my neighbors in Essex, a guy named Harold Burnham, who at that point was a young man. We were both young men. You can see he's got brown hair in that picture. He doesn't have any hair at all now. What he has is great. He can grow a great beard, though, which is more than I can say. But Harold was not as well known as he now. Of course, Harold is a National Heritage Fellow who's known all over the place. Has been on the cover of Wooden Boat magazine multiple times. He's very well known for the boats that he's built, and he's built 5 sizable schooners. Then he did not have the reputation that he enjoyed now. He'd only built one of those boats at that point. I'm sorry, he had built 2 boats. He had built the Lannon and the Story. And I asked Harold to come up with a proposal for building the Hannah. And so I got a general idea of what it would cost and what the boat would look like, and Harold came up with a design and carved me a model. And we went and we met with the folks from the Washington's Naval Base group, this group of Beverly citizens that had wanted to build the Hannah for years. And this is where the bake sales come in, because that's where they were. They'd started this wonderful, well-intentioned organization. They were never able to raise the money. They had a bake sale, they'd spend the bake sale money, they'd have another bake sale, they'd spend the bake sale money. And they were caught in that loop. They were never making tracks towards the 5 and the 6 and the 7-digit kinds of numbers that you would need to really start this project in earnest. And then I get introduced to Alan Hovey, who said, no, that we're not going to build Harold's version of Hannah. We're going to build our version of the Hannah. And one of the things that Alan Hovey believed, like I said, he believed that the vessel had been quite a bit larger, which obviously would have been a much more expensive vessel to build. And the important thing to Alan Hovey was that it had actual 4-pound cannon on board that could be fired, which meant adding 10,000 pounds of artillery to the passenger deck, which would have been commercially ruinous. And probably a serious hurdle for the Coast Guard to jump over. They're gonna let us. The Coast Guard's not crazy about us even having swivel guns, much less having 4-pound carriage guns. Even a 4-pounder, although it's not a huge cannon, that's like a gym sock full of gunpowder every time you fire that thing. And each one of those 4-pounders would have weighed on his carriage probably close to 1,000 pounds. So that's a lot of ordnance. That was very important to Alan Hovey. So after putting the business plan together, I realized, number one, I didn't want to deal with Alan Hovey. Number two, I didn't really agree with their conclusions or their research. And number three, I just didn't think that Beverly, the waterfront at Beverly, the town of Beverly, could support a vessel. It clearly was not as further along as Salem is in terms of the number of annual visitors or the accessibility of the waterfront or the number of people on the waterfront at any given time. And I started to think that, as much as I loved the idea of building a historic replica, maybe Beverly wasn't the place to do it. Maybe we should build another boat, and maybe that boat should have something to do with Salem's history. So we built the Fame. As it turned out, probably a very similar size vessel, although a lot has happened between 1775, the Revolution, and the War of 1812. It's only one generation, but you know what? I mean, there were people alive when the Wright brothers flew for the first time who were still alive when they flew the first 747s in 1970. That's the kind of progress they were making with sailing vessels in the 19th century. And the vessels of 1812 would have sailed rings around anything from the Revolution. So I think and as we sail rings around the Friendship whenever she puts to sea, the Fame would have sailed rings around the Hannah for all kinds of reasons. But there she is being launched in 2003. So this is about 2 years after I've abandoned the project of building the Hannah. I went to Harold. Harold actually came up with the idea of he was the one who found the story of the Fame in a book called Shipbuilders of Essex by Dana Story. And he came to me and he said, Mike, what about this boat? And that just, once we saw that, we said, yes, this is the boat we're going to build. I gave Harold a check, I think it was for $20,000 or $30,000, and he started working on the design and looking for wood. And about a year and a half later, we had a boat. And there she is hitting the water. Next slide. And the next 25 years, we've been able to do what I had hoped to do. We were able to turn that historic replica of a schooner into a viable business. So we do day sales for Salem, obviously. People walk up to the ticket booth, buy tickets, and go sailing for an hour and 40 minutes. There we are in front of the Witter Island Lighthouse. You can see that the boat is very wide, which actually is great. Boats from that period were very wide, and they have tremendous the ability to carry a lot of people in comfort. People can kind of sit and be comfortable, which is nice because we do a lot of private events. Slide. So people bring food on board. We have all kinds of. We do a lot of wedding events. I don't like to do wedding ceremonies. A lot of pressure. I like doing rehearsals, and I like doing bachelor and bachelorette parties. That's a lot of fun. And a lot of times we get the Sunday morning Bloody Mary. Oh my God, my whole family's in town. What do I do with them? We get that cruise. That can be fun too. Great venue for events, which not something that I had thought about really. I think we were building the boat. I thought that our principal business would come from selling tickets, and because people come to Salem because they're interested in American history, they'll come out on the Fame and they'll want to learn about the War of 1812 and privateering, and they do. But the extent to which people have been interested in using it as a venue for parties and corporate entertaining was surprising, but gratifying, and it's definitely helped us make ends meet. We have a summer camp. We, for many, many years, had a summer camp. COVID killed off our summer camp, I'm sorry to say, but I was very, very proud of that program. When I built the boat, I was 39. I had young children. One of the first things that we did when we built the boat was we put together a summer camp program. So it was a day camp that lasted a week, like 9 to 3, Monday through Friday. And we took the kids sailing and taught them everything we could teach them. And we went out to Misery Island and jumped in the water. And we did not teach them to fire cannon, although we get very excited about the cannon. These kids are on a field trip on a Marblehead lobster boat. We had such fun with that program. It was killed off by COVID because they said you can have a camp, but no camper can be within 30 feet of any other camper. Which meant if we'd had a camp on the boat, it would have had one camper. That was the end of the camp. But since then, we've been doing something called Marine Society outings. The Salem Marine Society helps underwrite these day-long day sales. So we basically take a group of kids, 8 to 14 sailing, and generally we sail out to Misery Island, as we are in this picture. I'll pick up a mooring out there. The kids swim overboard and they eat lunch on the boat, and then we sail back. It's a lot of fun. It's not the week-long program where kids really get immersed in it. They really know their knots, really know the parts of the vessel by the end of the week. But it is something that we can do, that's easy to do, and that the kids continue to enjoy. And a lot of the kids who came out of this program are driving tugboats on the Mississippi, went to Maine Maritime or Mass Maritime, and it's really a source of great pride to us, the number of kids that came up through our program, discovered boating, and realized, I could actually do this. You can actually do this for a living. Sailing is not just for recreation anymore. We can work on schooners, we can work on tall ships, we can work on tugboats, we can be commercial fishermen. I'm very proud of all those kids. Every once in a while we get to do really fun stuff. Next year, guess who's coming? The tall ships are coming to Boston, coming back. And I should say there's going to be 2 big events on the East Coast, one in New York, one in Boston. So here's us at a couple of events. That's a Constitution turnaround sail. I just love the picture with the flag. When tall ships do visit, we try to sail in and out with them. This is, of course, the U.S. bark Eagle. That vessel was built. Does anyone know who christened the Eagle, the Coast Guard vessel, Eagle? His first name is Adolf. Yes, Hitler did. She was built by the German Navy as a training ship before the war, and we took her as reparations when the war ended.
Sister ship of the Gorge Fox, which is the
Yes,
German
she's a
training
sister
ship.
ship of the Gorge Fox. She was the horse vessel.
Yeah, she was war reparations.
Yep.
We took her from the Germans.
Yes, exactly. And you could just until very recently, the Eagle. If you ever looked at the Eagle on the front of the U.S. bark Eagle and said, "That's not very American-looking Eagle. That's kind of an interesting-looking Eagle." It's because it was the old German Eagle, which was just a little bit more rapacious-looking. And down here we're at the Gloucester Schooner Festival with another schooner built by my friend Harold. That's the first year that after he built his schooner, the Ardell. As you can see, the vessels are very similar. The Fame is kind of what they call a tobacco boat from about 1810 period, and Harold built himself a pinky schooner from, let's say, the 1820, 1830 period. From this angle, they look like sisters, don't they? And they're close enough that we can have a lot of arguments about who's faster, who's a better sailor. Probably Harold in both cases, but it's a lot of fun arguing about it. And that's pretty much it. I think there's one more slide. Oh yeah, beauty shot. So mostly when I see people in kayaks and paddle boards and jet skis, I try to run them over, generally. Very annoying. But one day I got an email in my email box, and the subject line of the email was Eric the jet skier. So I thought, oh shit, this is one of those guys that I tried to run over. He's probably going to give me a hard time. But this is what was in the email. He said, I was going by the boat the other day and I took this picture. This slide doesn't even do it justice, but it was by far and away the best picture that we had of the boat at that time. This is like year 2 or year 3. So we immediately dumped all our previous pictures and we used this as our brochure picture for years. And since then I've had to go easy on the jet skiers because they do have their purposes. And yeah, that's the fame as she looks now. Anyway, so I'll be happy to answer questions about this. I have no idea where we're on time because I turned my phone off.
Okay.
But if you have questions, I would love to talk about it. Or if not, I have some stuff that I brought. I wrote a book about the original fame. I wrote a book about all the other Salem privateers because I found so much great stuff when I was researching the fame that I said, wow, I got to come back to this some winter when I've got nothing to do and write about all these Salem privateers that no one's ever heard of that really did cool things. But I also brought some Hannah stuff because for the cruises, I've been waiting 25 years to have a Hannah hat. And my wife said the only reason I did the commemorative sales last week was so I could make Hannah hats. And she's right. And I'm not sorry because the hats came out really cool. And we sold a bunch of them to people who sailed with us on October 9th and October 10th. We still have about 6 or 7 or 8 left, so I brought those. If you like me, have always wanted to have a Hannah shirt or a Hannah hat, we have those for you. And also the books that I wrote, which I'd be happy to sign. And done. Thank you.
Okay, before we take questions, I want to do the raffle. And do you have the book? All right. Okay, we'll have Captain Mike pull the raffle winner.
Carol Stoya.
So why don't you people think of your questions, and I'll start Captain Mike off with my question. And that is, how does a kid from the mean streets of Sudbury, Mass. end up sailing for your life?
Wow, that's a good question. I actually did not come from a sailing family. My dad was in the Navy, but his job in the Navy was, he came out of UMass in 1952. They were drafting everybody. He was really worried that he'd get sent to Korea. And so he said, oh, I'm going to join a service that's not the Army. He had graduated with an accounting degree. He joined the Navy, and they made him a purser on a troop ship in the Mediterranean. So he actually had a pretty good gig. He actually served in a marine transport. It was a vessel designed to transport a brigade or a battalion of Marines. I'm not sure which. And he ran the store, which meant he spent 2 years selling Coca-Cola, chocolates, cigarettes, and condoms to the Marine Corps, and visiting every port you could think of in the Mediterranean. He went to Athens, he went to Marseille, he went to Rome. He saw the world, like in the ads. But other than that, no sailing background at all. But my parents sent me to summer camp. So send those kids to summer camp. They sent me to summer camp up in Maine. I discovered sailing on a little lake. They had these little wooden town class sloops. That was my first sailing experience, and I just immediately fell in love with it. I was already like a history nut when I was 11, and now I was a history and a sailing nut, so it was going to happen eventually. I was going to get myself in trouble with boats.
What part of Maine?
It was in a town called Washington, Maine, and the camp was called Madomic.
Was it
There's a sister camp called Metacowanda. The girls lived on the other side of the lake, and then we would sneak over there, and they would sneak over.
What city is it near? Bangor or?
I was 11, and I wasn't driving, so I didn't pay a lot of attention, and it was a very, very long car ride.
Long drive.
Okay, anybody have questions?
Good question. So I heard a rumor recently, like it's either solidified or before I keep telling the story to friends and family, that our Boston area code 617 was based off of the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th. Have you ever heard that rumor?
I never heard that, but it's brilliant. I would run with that. keep telling people that until someone proves you wrong.
So we'll see if it goes true.
Does anybody know when they instituted area codes?
52, 50, 49, 52.
And that would have been a federal effort, obviously.
Let me see my book.
So who's running the FCC in 1952? Some Eisenhower, maybe a
I
Truman
heard
appointee.
Boston got to choose, so
Yeah,
they
Boston
came up with
got
that
to
number for that reason. Yeah. Yeah,
I like
Bunker Hill. Never forget the date. Yeah.
More questions?
Did the Hannah ever sail again?
So there are differences of opinion about that, just like there are differences of opinions about who owned her, how big she was. That the guy that I was speaking of, Alan Hovey, he built that whole thesis, this unpublished manuscript, on the idea that she was rebuilt, that she was rechristened, and she was used as a dispatch vessel. I think that that's possible, but I think it's unlikely. I think what they knew about the Hannah after her first 2 months, September, October service, was that she wasn't very fast. And what do you want a vessel for if she's not fast during wartime? So I can't imagine why he's got a whole you should read his manuscript or see if you can find information about his theories online. But I just don't think so. So she probably returned to doing what she had been doing. She was already a 10-year-old vessel. She'd taken a lot of damage. You know, maybe she never made those long voyages again. Maybe she got used for other purposes. We just don't know. We do not know. We have no idea.
Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, this one back down.
Was that, the guy Collins? Was he the same one that went up and down the coast, like fired in Rhode Island and attacked Prudence Island? Was he the same? Captain?
John.
The British commander?
I mean, this is a guy who was active in the Delaware in earlier 1775. By the summer, fall of 1775, he's in Boston. So he and his vessel are up and down the East Coast.
Because I'm originally from Rhode Island, and I think it was the Collins that was the commander, and he attacked Prudence Island and burned the whole place down. And
It's entirely possible. Could absolutely be the same guy. Unfortunately, Collins is a pretty common name.
yeah.
So there are people in Salem who say, "Oh yeah, Collins Cove is named for Captain John Collins." Like, no, that is not true.
Anybody else?
There was a restaurant, I'm not sure, called the General Glover, in now in Milton Connection.
Oh yeah, anything named Glover is probably named after. Yeah, that's a very well-known thing. He was a very well-known guy, really like a local hero. And during the times of the Revolution, after the Revolution, he did not. The end of his life wasn't. He didn't meet with a lot of success later on in life. It was kind of a sad story, but he was very, very well known. And his family was well known and always identified with the successes of the Revolution and rowing Washington across to Delaware. So yeah. Especially in the Marblehead area, anything you see Glover is going to relate to him and to that family.
Anything else? Nina? Over here? Oh, Nina?
Yeah, no, I just am curious, it's not a deep question, but why is it they refer to as she?
I'm not going to touch that one with a 10-foot pole. There's a whole bunch of very pat answers, about boats being unpredictable, and I'm not going to go there. There are some people in this woke era that are trying to get us to not refer to ships as with gender pronouns. But for people like myself who've been doing it our whole lives, I don't see maybe the next generation will have more success if they really want to not do it. I mean, you're never going to get the guys like me to stop. It's yeah.
I have nothing.
You'd have to cut it out of me.
I have nothing against it, I'm just curious.
I have no problem with it either way. I'm too old to change my ways now.
Any more questions that I see? One last thing, what did they tell George Washington about the damage that they did to the
Oh, they said that the schooner was hardly damaged and it wouldn't be a problem, and that they covered up the whole thing. Again, Alan Hovey loved cover-ups, so that's one of the themes of his book, that there was this giant cover-up. But the damage was probably pretty severe. I mean, that was a vessel that was probably going full speed when they ran it aground. If you want to run aground a boat on the beach and then jump off of it, you want it to be going fast when you hit the beach so that it slides up a ways, right? You want to get out of the 6-7 foot water, maybe up into the 4 or 5 foot water, because that's how tall those guys were. Right? No one wants to jump in the water that's over their head. So my guess is they kept her going, full steam right up till they hit the beach, and they jumped off the bow into 4 or 5 feet of water. And like I said, it was October. Nicholson broke and got a cold, and so therefore he was one of the major casualties.
And Washington probably didn't get any more bad news, so he...
Washington, well, he's about to get really good news, because about a month after this, they captured a British munition ship called the Nancy, which was just full of all the things Washington wanted, gunpowder and muskets and all kinds of great stuff, just like, fiddler's green for Washington. And that was captured by a guy named Manley, Captain Manley, which you can read about him. He had a very interesting and checkered career. But eventually this strategy did pay off. I mean, it wasn't lack of supplies that made the British leave, but they were making progress and they did capture some valuable ships.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Good start to our season.